There's a power that exists in the spaces between words, a force that lives in the moments when you choose not to speak. It's a power that most people will never understand because they've been conditioned from birth to fill every silence with sound, to explain themselves constantly, to justify their actions, to defend their choices, to prove their worth through an endless stream of words. But Niccolò Machiavelli, sitting in his study 5 centuries ago, watching the rise and fall of princes and the intricate dance of power in Renaissance Italy, understood something that cuts against every instinct we've been taught. He understood that silence, wielded consciously and strategically, is not the absence of power. It is power in its purest, most concentrated form. Think about the last time you felt compelled to fill an uncomfortable silence. Maybe you were in a meeting and someone criticized your work, and you immediately launched into an explanation, a justification, a defense of your decisions. Or perhaps you were in an argument with someone you care about, and the moment they stopped talking, you rushed to fill the void with more words, more explanations, more attempts to make them understand your perspective. Or maybe you've sat across from someone who remained silent after you made a request, and that silence made you so uncomfortable that you started talking again, lowering your demands, explaining why you didn't really need what you'd asked for, negotiating against yourself before they'd even said a word. We've all been there. We've all felt the almost unbearable pressure of silence and responded by surrendering our power through speech. But what if you could train yourself to do the opposite? What if you could learn to sit comfortably in silence while others squirm? What if you could harness the psychological weight of the unspoken word, the strategic value of the withheld response, the devastating effectiveness of simply saying nothing when everyone expects you to speak? This is not about being passive. This is not about weakness or avoidance or fear of confrontation. This is about understanding that in a world drowning in noise, in endless chatter, in the constant compulsion to broadcast every thought and feeling and opinion, the person who can control their speech, who can choose silence deliberately and consciously, becomes someone that others cannot read, cannot predict, and therefore cannot control. Machiavelli observed this principle operating at the highest levels of power. He watched as princes who talked too much revealed their strategies to their enemies. He saw politicians who explained themselves excessively create opportunities for others to find weaknesses in their logic. He noticed that the leaders who commanded the most respect and inspired the most fear were often those who spoke the least, who listened more than they talked, who allowed others to fill silences with their own anxieties and assumptions and self-incriminating revelations. The silent leader became a blank screen onto which others projected their fears, their hopes, their interpretations, rarely accurate, but always revealing of the person doing the projecting. Let me take you into a specific moment to illustrate what this looks like in practice. Imagine a negotiation. Two parties sit across from each other. One party makes an offer. It's a lowball offer, clearly designed to anchor the negotiation in their favor. The natural human response is to react immediately, to show displeasure, to counteroffer, to explain why the offer is insulting, to justify why you deserve more. But watch what happens when you do none of those things. When you simply sit in silence, looking at the person who made the offer, your face neutral, revealing nothing. The silence stretches. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. And in that silence, something fascinating occurs. The person who made the offer begins to interpret your silence. Are you angry? Are you considering walking away? Are you so unimpressed that their offer doesn't even merit a response? They don't know. And in not knowing, they become uncomfortable. And in their discomfort, they often begin to negotiate against themselves. They might say, "Of course, we could potentially go a bit higher." You remain silent. They continue. "What if we adjusted the terms like this?" Still, you say nothing. Your silence is doing the work that 1,000 words could never accomplish. You're making them uncertain. You're making them reveal their true position, their actual flexibility, their real constraints. And you're doing all of this without giving away a single piece of information about your own position, your own needs, your own limits. This is the tactical brilliance of silence. It extracts information while revealing nothing. It applies pressure without apparent effort. It dominates the interaction without aggression. But Machiavelli understood that silence operates on an even deeper level than mere tactical advantage in negotiations. Silence is psychologically destabilizing in ways that most people don't consciously recognize, but everyone unconsciously feels. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. We're constantly trying to read the people around us, to predict their behavior, to understand their intentions. And we do this primarily through verbal and nonverbal communication. When someone speaks, they give us data. We can analyze their words, their tone, their emphasis, their hesitations. We can construct a model of what they're thinking and feeling and planning. But when someone remains silent, especially in a situation where speech is expected, our pattern recognition machinery breaks down. We can't build a reliable model of what's happening in their mind. And this uncertainty triggers anxiety. This is why silence is so powerful in the aftermath of conflict or confrontation. When someone attacks you verbally, insults you, tries to provoke you, and you respond with silence, you create a kind of psychological vacuum. They've thrown their energy at you. And instead of catching it and throwing it back, which is what they expect, what they're prepared for, you simply let it dissipate into the void of your non-response. This is profoundly disorienting. They don't know if you're hurt, if you're planning retaliation, if you even register the attack, if you consider them beneath your notice. Your silence forces them to sit with their own aggression, to hear their own words echoing back to them without the satisfaction of a reaction. And often, in that silence, they begin to question themselves. Was I too harsh? Did I misread the situation? Why aren't they responding? What are they thinking? Machiavelli saw this dynamic play out repeatedly in the courts of Renaissance Italy. The courtier who responded immediately to every slight, who defended their honor loudly and publicly, often appeared weak despite their protestations of strength. But the courtier who could be insulted to their face and simply smile slightly, say nothing, and walk away, that courtier was feared, because no one knew what they were thinking. No one knew what they might do. The silence suggested a depth of character, a security in oneself, a confidence that didn't require verbal defense. And it suggested something potentially more dangerous, that they were operating at a level of strategic thinking where an immediate response would be beneath them, where they were playing a longer game that the insulter couldn't even perceive. This connects to another crucial aspect of silence that Machiavelli understood. It protects you from your own impulsiveness. How many times have you said something in anger that you later regretted? How many relationships have been damaged? How many opportunities lost? How many enemies created unnecessarily because you spoke from emotion rather than strategy? The person who has mastered the weapon of silence has inserted a circuit breaker between stimulus and response. When provoked, they pause. In that pause, the initial emotional surge begins to subside. They can assess the situation more clearly. They can ask themselves, what is this person trying to accomplish? What would they like me to say or do? What outcome actually serves my interests? And then they can choose to speak or to remain silent based on strategic calculation rather than emotional compulsion. Let me tell you about a historical example that Machiavelli would have appreciated, though it happened after his time. There was a general who, when insulted by a subordinate officer in front of other men, said absolutely nothing. He didn't reprimand the officer. He didn't defend himself. He simply looked at the officer for a long moment, then continued with his briefing as if nothing had happened. The subordinate officer, expecting either anger or some kind of response, was thrown completely off balance. In the days that followed, he became increasingly anxious, not knowing what consequences might be coming, not understanding the general's silence. Eventually, he approached the general privately and apologized, something he would never have done if the general had responded in the moment with anger or punishment. The silence had accomplished what anger never could have. It had made the subordinate officer confront his own behavior without the general having to say a single word about it. This illustrates another layer of silence's power. It transfers the burden of interpretation and action onto the other person. When you remain silent, especially in a situation charged with expectation, the other person is forced to fill that silence with meaning. And the meaning they choose to fill it with tells you everything you need to know about them. Their assumptions, their fears, their guilt, their hopes. All of it comes spilling out into the space your silence has created. You become like a mirror, reflecting back their own psychological landscape while revealing nothing of your own. This is why the best interrogators often use silence as their primary tool. They ask a question and then they wait. And in that waiting, in that silence that becomes increasingly uncomfortable, people confess things they never intended to reveal, simply because they cannot bear the weight of the unspoken. Machiavelli also understood that silence conveys status in ways that speech often cannot. Think about how status typically operates in human interactions. The person of lower status usually speaks more, explains more, justifies more. They're trying to prove their worth, to earn approval, to justify their presence or their decisions. The person of higher status speaks less because they don't feel the need to justify themselves. Their status is secure. They don't need your approval. This is why powerful people often speak in short, declarative sentences, while less powerful people speak in long, qualifying, explanation-filled paragraphs. When you train yourself to embrace silence, when you stop feeling compelled to fill every gap in conversation, when you become comfortable with pauses and with letting others do the explaining and justifying, you unconsciously communicate higher status. But here's what's important to understand. This is not about arrogance. It's not about being dismissive or disrespectful. It's about being secure enough in yourself that you don't need to prove anything through constant speech. It's about understanding that your value doesn't decrease because you're not constantly verbalizing it. In fact, the opposite is true. The person who is always talking, always explaining, always defending, often appears insecure regardless of what they're actually saying. While the person who can sit comfortably in silence, who can listen more than they speak, who responds thoughtfully rather than reactively, appears confident and grounded. There's also a creative dimension to silence that Machiavelli would have appreciated. When you're constantly talking, constantly filling space with words, you're operating from your surface thoughts, from the easily accessible ideas and responses that come quickly to mind. But these are rarely your best thoughts, your best insights, your most creative solutions, your deepest understanding. These emerge from silence, from the space where your mind can move beyond the obvious and into something more profound. The person who cannot tolerate silence in their own mind, who always needs to be consuming information or producing speech, never descends to the depths where real wisdom lives. Machiavelli himself practiced this. His greatest work was written in exile, in silence, away from the noise and drama of the Florentine court. In that silence, he could reflect on everything he'd observed, could see patterns that weren't visible when he was caught up in the daily tumult of political life. His silence was not empty. It was full of observation, analysis, and synthesis. This is the paradox of silence. It appears empty from the outside, but for the person practicing it, it can be incredibly rich and productive. Now let's address the question that might be forming in your mind. If silence is so powerful, why don't more people use it? The answer is that silence is deeply uncomfortable, and we're not trained to tolerate discomfort. From childhood, we're taught to fill silences. When a teacher asks a question and no one answers, the silence becomes painful, anxiety-inducing. In social situations, silence is interpreted as awkwardness, as failure of the interaction. We've been conditioned to believe that good communication means constant verbal exchange, that silence represents some kind of breakdown or problem that needs to be fixed immediately. But what if we've been taught wrong? What if the constant noise, the endless chatter, the compulsive need to fill every moment with words? What if all of that is actually a form of weakness? What if real strength is measured not by how much you can say, but by how much you can refrain from saying? Machiavelli would argue that the latter is true. He would say that the person who has mastered silence has achieved a level of self-control that most people never reach. They've overcome one of the deepest human compulsions, the need to be heard, to be understood, to have their perspective validated through expression. So, how do you develop this power? How do you train yourself to embrace silence as a weapon? It begins with awareness. Start noticing how often you speak from compulsion rather than choice. Notice how often you fill silences because they make you uncomfortable. Notice how often you explain yourself unnecessarily, justify decisions that don't require justification, defend against criticisms that don't merit defense. Just notice these patterns without judgment. Then start practicing small moments of deliberate silence. When someone asks you a question, pause before answering. Let there be a moment of silence where you actually consider your response rather than speaking reflexively. When someone criticizes you, resist the urge to immediately defend yourself. Let the criticism sit in silence for a moment. See what happens. You'll discover something interesting. Most of the time, nothing bad happens. The world doesn't end. People don't think less of you. In fact, they often respect you more. They interpret your silence as thoughtfulness, as confidence, as depth. And gradually, you'll become more comfortable with silence. You'll begin to see it not as something to be avoided, but as a tool to be used. You'll start to recognize moments where silence serves you better than speech. And in those moments, you'll choose silence consciously and strategically. This is what Machiavelli knew that transformed his understanding of power. Silence is not passive. It's not weakness. It's an active choice, a strategic deployment of non-response that can accomplish what no amount of eloquent speech could achieve. It makes you unpredictable. It protects you from your own impulsiveness. It forces others to reveal themselves. It conveys status. It creates space for deeper thought. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates a level of self-mastery that is rare and therefore powerful. In a world that never stops talking, that broadcasts every thought and feeling and opinion, that measures worth by visibility and volume, the person who can be silent becomes dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of threatening harm, but dangerous in the sense that they cannot be controlled through the usual means. You cannot manipulate someone through their words if they're not speaking. You cannot trap someone in their own statements if they haven't made any. You cannot predict someone's strategy if they haven't revealed it through constant explanation. So the next time you feel the compulsion to speak, to explain, to defend, to fill an uncomfortable silence, remember Machiavelli's wisdom. Remember that your silence might be the most powerful response you could give. Remember that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is absolutely nothing. And remember that in the space your silence creates, others will reveal everything you need to know while you reveal nothing. That is the weapon Machiavelli understood. That is the power that silence holds. And that is why mastering it makes you dangerous in the best possible way. Your silence is more powerful than you know. Subscribe to Dark Psychology Ascent and learn to wield the strategies that Machiavelli mastered centuries ago. Every day, we explore the hidden principles of influence, control, and self-mastery that separate those who are controlled from those who cannot be touched. Stop filling the void with words. Start commanding it with silence. Your ascent begins now.